Max woke up the following morning with a hangover. He had spent the night in the spare bedroom after they had finished the barbecue the night before. True to her word, Karen had finished her last bottle of German wine and gone home. They had finished at about 8 p.m. and the sun was beginning to go down and sending long shadows across the back garden. It was still pleasantly warm, and the remaining of three of them hadn't wanted really to go in. It was too nice an evening to waste, and they sat outside until the sun had finally disappeared. There was an outside light on the patio, and Kurt had turned it on so they could see what they were doing. There were still cans of beer in the fridge, and though Max was feeling that he'd had enough to drink, John kept bringing another one out as soon as he'd finished his current one. They talked about everything, about life in Brussels, people they knew, friends who they hadn't seen for a while, how quiet it was here living in the country, how they missed the city life sometimes, but how happy both John and Kurt were to have left the noise of the traffic behind them. It would have been difficult to have had a barbecue in their apartment, but now they were free to do whatever they wanted, when they wanted. The only downside was that it was far from friends to travel from the centre of Brussels. In reality, it wasn't that far. Tavern was situated on the edge of the city limits, but people had a tendency to remain in the centre. That was where everything was, so the idea of making the journey out to a town away from the centre was something that people really didn't want to do on a regular basis. For Max, this wasn't a concern. He liked the immediacy of living in the city, but on an evening like this, he didn't miss it. He'd grown up in the country, and although he had lived in a city most of his adult life, he still missed the peace and quiet of living in the country. Also, the warm summer evenings was something that he wasn't used to. Where he lived in Birmingham, as soon as the sun went down, the air turned cold. Even if it had been warm during the day, the evenings were always cold, and that had a tendency to spoil the evenings. Here in Tavern, the temperature hadn't dropped to any great degree, and they were all able to stay out until the late, only wearing their shorts and t-shirt. It was just a warm evening. Kurt had been the first to retire, explaining that he was now tired, which left John and Max alone on the patio to continue chatting. More beers were brought out of the fridge, even by now they were both thoroughly drunk. They chatted about everything. Life back in Britain, their lives before moving here, what it was like to be an expat in Brussels, what it was like to be gay in Brussels, everything. Life, the universe, and everything. In those late hours, Max and John became firm friends and discovered that they had a lot in common, more than Max would ever believe they would have. For Max, he liked this John, this stranger he'd only met a few weeks ago. He liked who he was, what he'd achieved, his relaxed ability to live a gay life with his boyfriend without even considering what other people might not agree with. Might not agree with his lifestyle. John didn't care. He was his own man with his own views. If people didn't like him or didn't approve, then he didn't care. All he cared about was Kurt and Tosca and his own life. He was totally immune to what the rest of the world thought about him. If they didn't like him, then they could go away. He only concerned himself with people who accepted who he was. Max liked him. He liked his strength. He liked the way that he was able to create a life for himself that he was comfortable with. It took a lot of strength and determination to do it, but John had achieved it. Max envied him. He hoped that he had the strength and personality to do the same for himself. He knew that if he was going to achieve this, then he would have to have an inner strength in himself. He had made a start, though. and with these new friends, he thought that there was really a chance now that he could achieve it. He just needed time. It was Sunday morning, and he was slowly waking up in a bedroom that he didn't really at first recognize. After a few seconds, he came around and remembered he was in a spare bedroom. He had taken off his clothes and had fallen asleep in his underpants. The sun was shining through the small bedroom window, and he blinked in the bright light. After a few minutes of laying there trying to wake up, he pushed back the duvet, moved his legs over to the side of the bed and placed them on the floor. Outside in the house, he could hear movement. Someone was walking about in the kitchen. Otherwise, it was quiet. He was not used to this. Ever since moving into his apartment in the centre of Brussels, he had come used to the never-ending noise of the city. Close to his apartment was a bar which often stayed open late, so even if he wanted to go to bed to sleep, he couldn't, because he could hear the sound of people in the street below. Then, in the morning, the bar would have its empty glasses and bottles collected, which meant tipping bins full of empty bottles into a truck. The noise they made echoed around the streets. In his own apartment, he was lucky if there was 2 or 3 hours of quiet during the night. He was beginning to realize that he may be suffering from sleep deprivation. He had certainly slept well last night. On this Sunday morning, he could get up in the gentle quiet of the countryside and not have to rush or do anything that he didn't really want to do. Neither Kurt or John had disturbed him, obviously allowing him to wake up in his own way. Pulling his clothes on, Max made his way out of the bedroom and into the kitchen. John was busy tidying up the remains of the barbecue. Kurt was in the third bedroom, which he had converted into an office. There he had his computers arranged where he could play his online games. This was something that Kurt did on a regular basis. He enjoyed playing computer games, and it was his way of relaxing. John, however, was not interested, and was happy to allow Kurt his own space without disturbing him. "Do you want a coffee?" asked John as he busied himself putting away the dishes from the previous evening. "It's over there," he continued, pointing towards an electric coffee-making machine in the corner of the kitchen. Max made his way past the large centre counter in the centre of the room and over to the coffee machine at the other side of the kitchen. He took a small cup and, placing it under the spout, he pushed a button and the hot coffee started pouring automatically out of the machine. "Did you sleep well?" asked John. "Yes, I think so," replied Max sleepily. "I'm a bit hungover, though. I think we drank a bit too much." "Too much?" replied John in a loud, surprised voice. "Have you seen the number of beer cans I had to put away in the garbage bag?" He pointed to a blue plastic sack that stood in the other corner of the kitchen, which was filled with empty beer cans. "You're joking," replied Max, filling the coffee cup from the machine. "They are all yours," replied John, sounding slightly annoyed. Max shook his head. Oh no, he replied, laughing sarcastically. "Not all. You were drinking the same amount as me," he said empathetically. "I only had 1 or 2, replied John, looking offended. Max laughed. "Oh no, you're not blaming this on me," he replied, placing his coffee cup on the side and looking around for the sugar and milk. "Anyway," said John, looking accusingly at him, "we'll all have to go out later and get some more. The fridge is nearly empty." He stopped for a while and looked at Max. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Milk and sugar," replied Max, looking around the kitchen. "Milk is in the fridge," he replied. "Sugar is in the cupboard next to you." Max nodded and opened the fridge. took out a carton of milk and poured some into his cup. He closed the fridge door and opened one of the overhead cupboards. There was a bag of sugar in one of the shelves. He took the bag out and placed it on the side. "Spoon?" he asked. John reached for one of the drawers in the kitchen centre and, pulling it open, took out a spoon. "Here," he said, annoyed, and handed Max a spoon. "Thanks," replied Max, and placed one spoonful of the sugar into his coffee cup and stirred it. John shook his head. I don't take sugar in coffee," he said. "It's bad for you." Max shrugged and took a drink from the cup. Moving into the lounge, Max went and sat on the sofa by a large window which looked out onto the front of the house. The morning sunshine was streaming through it into the room. Outside he could see the road and a single car pass by as he watched. At the far side of the road there was a line of tall trees and the closed gates which led to the neighbour's house. It was difficult to see the house from this point because he could just make out that it was a large building standing alone in its own grounds. In the corner, the TV was showing some Sunday morning programme, but it was in French, and Max didn't really understand what it was. He settled back into the sofa and took a drink from his coffee cup. After a few minutes, John came into the lounge carrying what it looked like a large book. "Have you seen this?" he asked, indicating the book. "No," replied Max. "What is it?" "It's my photo album from the choir," he replied. John came in and sat next to him on the sofa and placed the album on his lap. Carefully, he opened it and revealed a series of photos. "Choir?" asked Mac, looking down at the photo album. "You are a member of a choir?" "Not just a member," replied John, looking up and smiling at him. "It's my choir. I run it. It's called Chorus Unlimited, and I've been doing it for a few years now. We usually have about 100 members." So you're musical, are you?" asked Max, slightly surprised at this. In all the weeks he had known John, he had never mentioned it. "Opera," he replied. "I love opera. All opera. The choir, though, normally sing traditional church music." Looking down, he started leafing through the photos. "We usually do 2 concerts a year. A carol concert at Christmas and then an Easter concert. They're very popular. We always get a full house for our concerts." As John showed Max each of the photos, he gave a short explanation of where it had been taken, who was in it, and what they were singing. They were very good photos and clearly taken by an experienced photographer. As John went from one photo to another, Max was beginning to realize that this was something about John that he had never realized. John was clearly enthusiastic and engaged with this group. His pride was clear to see, and he became more and more involved with each of the photos, giving more and more information. The choir was mainly made up of amateurs who came along every week to rehearse. The rehearsals were held in a small hall in the centre of Brussels and was a social affair. John was the head of the choir, and it was up to him to organise the weekly events and make sure that everyone had a good time. He had made a lot of friends through this over the years, and his name was well known around Brussels. There were 1 or 2 other choirs, but John always liked to think that this was the most famous. His concerts at Christmas and Easter were always eagerly looked forward to. He tried to make sure that these concerts were held in different locations around the city, sometimes in small theatres, sometimes in churches. They were always well attended, and occasionally they had to turn people away if there wasn't enough room or enough seats. This was his passion. He talked enthusiastically as he went through each photo one by one. When he was not talking about the choir, he was talking about operas he had seen. He was well known at the Brussels Royal Opera House, La Monnaie du Monde, and knew the director, who he considered to be one of his personal friends. Through his work with music, he'd become friends with a small group of influential people in the government and politics and people in the European Union. Everyone knew John, and he relished it. Music was his life and his passion. He talked about his favourite operas. He liked Verdi, Mozart, and Puccini. He wasn't a big fan of modern operas. He preferred the classics and talked about the different opera singers he had met over the years. He then suggested that Max should come along to the rehearsals. They were held every Wednesday evening, and they always needed more people. "I can't sing," replied Max. "That's okay," replied John. "You can help with the evening. Kurt usually has to do it all on his own, and I'm sure he would welcome the extra help. There's always a lot to do before the others arrive, and then we have to clear up afterwards." Max thought for a while, and then sort of agreed. The meeting hall wasn't far from his apartment, and he was sure that he could make it. After all, what else is there to do on a Wednesday evening?